Please join me in welcoming David Bereit.
Well, good. What are we still in the morning? Good morning. Are you excited to be here? That was not convincing. All right, let me try that again. Remember, we're here to save lives. We're here to end abortion. Are you excited to be here? Yes! Thank you. That's much more convincing. So the theme of our time together today at this Southern Maryland Pro-Life Symposium is gaining momentum. I wanted to spend a few moments reflecting on those words and the significance they have for what we are gathered here today to do. And more importantly than what we're gathered here today to do, what we will do tomorrow and the next day and the next day. So the word momentum, when you think about it, in science, momentum is mass times velocity. But its application in life is where it becomes incredibly powerful. In sports, they call momentum the big mo. And if you've ever seen a sports game where you have one team that is just driving forward, it almost seems that they're unstoppable. And sometimes you can even see the momentum shift in a game. Let's say it's a football game, and they go into the halftime, and one of the teams is ahead. But something happens in the locker room, because the team that is down comes back out with a new determination and a new commitment. And all of a sudden, the entire game shifts, and you can see it in the attitude and the way they play, and that team starts driving momentum. They move down the field, they score. They move down the field again, and they score, and they shift the entire game because the momentum shifted. Have you ever seen that in a game? So let's use another example of momentum. In the 1800s, there was a couple that lived in the mountains of Missouri. And this couple heard that there was this new thing coming through their area called the train. And they heard that down in town they were laying the tracks and that they were getting ready to have the trains come through their part of Missouri. So one day, as this was getting ready to launch, they decided, we're going to go down into town. And we're going to see this giant iron horse. And so Ma and Pa rode down into town. And when they got into town, there were the shiny new tracks leading out of town. And right there at the station was a brand new giant train engine. It was sitting there, and there was steam coming out. And Ma looked over at Pa, and she said, Pa, what do you think about that? Pa looked at that giant vehicle sitting there, and he said, they'll never get it moving. A few minutes later, the whistle blows. The steam starts pouring out. The wheels start to just inch forward. It begins to creep away from the station. Inch by inch, the wheels start turning faster and faster. And the train starts to get going. It gets some speed going, and it starts picking up that momentum. And as it's shooting down the tracks, heading out of town, out of sight, Ma turns back to Pa again, and she says, Pa, what do you think about that? He says, they'll never get it stopped. So literally, it had to get started, but once it got started, in his view, the momentum meant it was unstoppable. How do we apply that to today? How do we apply that to this critical cause that led to you on a Saturday, putting aside all the other things you could be doing, spending time with friends or family, or doing something recreational, or just sleeping in? Instead, you're here. Why? Because we understand that we need to gain momentum in this crucial cause for human rights. One of the blessings I had in my experience, the decade I worked at 40 Days for Life, is I got to travel to dozens of other countries, as well as all 50 states, more than 500 cities over the last 10 years. And one of the interesting things that I started to experience, and Margaret and my children went with me on many of the international trips, one of the things we started to hear in every country we went to, people said, you know what gives us hope? The pro-life movement in the United States. And at first that kind of struck me because we look at the problems sometimes instead of realizing the progress. But it began to happen more frequently, and it was never something we sought out. It was never something that we triggered and stimulated, but instead people would come up to us over and over again. I remember when we were in Madrid, Spain, and a woman came up to me, and she was a reporter for a publication there in Madrid. And she said, David, whenever things get bad here and we look at the crisis of abortion, in abortion here it's treated largely like birth control, and people don't think about it. The laws are very permissive, and it's horrible. And whenever we get down, whenever we get depressed and we need hope, we look to stories of what is happening in the United States of America. That's where we get our hope. That's what we cling to. We had the same experience in Australia. We had that happen across Croatia. I will never forget a night that I spent in London, England. We were doing a training for pro-life leaders from across Europe and from Africa. And there was a journalist there as well. And after the event wrapped up, we were walking through the streets of London, and she pulled me away from the rest of the group, and she said, you know, David, we British are a very, very proud people. And I said, no kidding. I never knew that. She said, we would never admit this publicly, but we look to the United States, to the pro-life movement, not only for inspiration, but for leadership. And she said to me, she said, if you ever want to know the greatest gift that America can give to the rest of the world, end abortion in the United States, and the rest of the world will follow. End abortion in the United States, and the rest of the world will follow. So clearly, our train as a pro-life movement has moved away from the station. It's beginning to head down the tracks. But the question is, how do we continue to gain momentum? We can look at the statistics, we can look at the facts and realize Gallup did a poll just earlier this year, and they looked at all the different moral issues. And Americans' views on moral issues are shifting radically left faster than ever before, and it's very problematic to those of us who come to these issues from a biblical or Christian worldview, where we look at virtue as an important part of our cultural makeup. But there was one issue, and only one, where not only was it not moving away from the position of virtue, but it actually was moving forward just a little bit, and that issue was on the issue of abortion. More Americans are pro-life than ever before, some polls showing by a 12-point majority of those who self-identify as pro-life versus those who self-identify as pro-choice. We are beginning to see some movement, and we're beginning to see some progress. So clearly there is a beginning of momentum, but we're not here just to simply get started. We're here to gain momentum. That's the theme. That's why we're here. Because it's not enough to rest easy and say, we're making some progress. Things are beginning to happen. Abortion rates are going down a little bit. A few lives are being saved. That's not enough. Because when we look at the problem around us, we realize we are up against the defining issue of our generation. History is not going to remember us by our great accomplishments or our monuments or our financial prowess. They're not going to remember us by the technology we developed. History will remember us by how we faced and met and overcame our greatest challenge. And what is our greatest challenge? It's the challenge of abortion. Abortion is the leading cause of death in America and throughout the world. And since the Roe v. Wade Supreme Court decision, when 7 men, mind you, imposed abortion upon all 50 states, since that time, more than 58 million American children have perished. Every year, another 1.1 million children, as Josh was saying, knit together in a mother's womb, made in God's image and likeness, lose their lives in a nation that was founded on an inalienable right to what? To life. Every year it continues. And we can look here in Maryland, and even though, regrettably, your state legislature refuses to take accountability for what is happening here, we do know that the abortion industry in its last reported year documented 28,140 abortions in Maryland. And divide that by 365 days of the year, and you realize that every day, including today, as we are here, 77 children will perish in your state on your watch. And tomorrow, 77 more. And the next day, 77 more. And the question is, if we are going to come together here today and we're going to take time away from everything else, are we going to learn and be empowered and equipped to go back out and make sure that number continues heading down until it ultimately becomes zero? Are we committed to keep building momentum? And if so, then we need to make this time together really count. Let me give you an example, and then I'll flesh this out a bit more, of how important this can be and why we do it. There's a video, I don't know if any of you have seen, there's a TED Talk video by Simon Sinek. It's one of the most watched TED Talk videos, and it's called Start With Why. And the whole premise of this is that many times when we're trying to convince people to do something, we tell about the what or the how, but we need to begin with the why. And that's what we need to remember as we recharge, as we energize ourselves and prepare to go back out and change the culture in Maryland and across this nation. Several years back, my wife and I were living in Texas, and I was involved in the pro-life movement at this point, and I had been asked to speak for a pregnancy center in the Philadelphia area. It was actually in Chester County, Pennsylvania. And this pregnancy center had asked me to come talk, and it was the night before the talk, and frankly, I was tired. I didn't want to go. And I remember Margaret and I sitting on our couch the night before I went on that trip, and I said, Margaret, I'm just exhausted. We've been so busy with so many other things. This place wants me to come talk. I'm really tired. I really would prefer not to go. And she said, David, you made a commitment. You have to honor your commitment. She said, you need to go. And so reluctantly, I got on the plane from Texas and flew to Pennsylvania, to Philadelphia, and went to Chester County. And that night spoke at the event. And there were hundreds of people there, and I did the best I could, but I still the whole time just kind of had this sense of, am I making a difference? Is this really, we're preaching to the choir, is this really making an impact? And we finished up the event, and everybody was leaving, and they were picking up the chairs and moving the tables, and a man came walking over to me. And this man was wearing a very nice, clearly expensive suit. He was well-groomed, clearly a man of means, a younger man. And he walked over, and in his suit pocket, he pulled out a picture. He said, Mr. Bereit, do you know what this is? And he handed it to me. And it was an ultrasound picture. And I looked at it and I said, yeah, it's an ultrasound. Those of us in pro-life have seen those pictures of babies in the womb. Yeah, we knew what it was. He said, can you make anything specific out in this picture? I looked at it and I said, no, I've seen a bunch of ultrasounds, just kind of a lot of static and I can't really make it out. He said, that's because there's more in there than normal. He said, there's 4. Those are my quadruplets. He said, my wife just found out, she knew she was pregnant, but she just went to the doctor and found out that she was pregnant with 4 babies. And the first thing the doctor said is, oh, that's probably more than you can handle, so we need to do one of 2 things. We either need to do a selective reduction and get rid of a few of them to help the other ones thrive better and for you as a parent to be able to love on those children more effectively, or we just need to wipe out this pregnancy and start all over again. Basically saying either kill some or all of the children. He said everybody began to come around her and say, you know what? Yeah, that's what you need to do. And he said, I'm ashamed to admit it, but I began to come alongside those people, and I began to pressure her, and he said, she's scheduled for that abortion next week. He said, I came here tonight very reluctantly. I did not want to be here, as you can imagine. I said, I can imagine. He said, a friend invited me to sit at his table, and I owed him a favor, so I had to come. He said, but when I got in this room, and I was surrounded by hundreds of people who are willing to invest their time, their talent, and their treasure to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, children they may never even meet. He said, I couldn't help but thinking, how can I do any less for my own flesh and blood? He said, you may wonder as you're traveling around and going to the different places and speaking at these events, he said, you may wonder sometimes if it's ever making a difference. He said, tonight it made a difference for this dad, and for my 4 children we are keeping. I walked away from that event transformed. I called Margaret, and I was in tears sharing the story with her, and flew back home, and it rejuvenated me for a long time in my pro-life work, but nothing like the following Easter, when I got an email from an address I didn't even recognize, and it had an attachment. Now, what are you supposed to do with an email that comes to you that you don't recognize that has an attachment? It's got to be a virus, right? But for some reason, I felt that I needed to open it, and I double-clicked it, and a picture popped open on my computer. And it was a picture of those 4 little girls propped up against a pillow wearing little pink bunny suits. That's why we do this. We don't do this to pat ourselves on the back. We don't do this because it's the fun thing to do. There are challenges. Having those kind of conversations that Josh was talking about, they're not easy. We are going to fail. We are going to experience setbacks and frustrations. But as Margaret and I were driving over here this morning, I just said, what's something that can share to remember why we do this? And she reminded me of that story. I haven't even shared it in years. But that's why we do this. Because children are at risk right now. Because women are at risk right now. Because hearts and minds can be changed. Because eternal souls can be impacted. And so today, let me just share a little of the journey that God has taken me on. And hopefully through this, it will be a little bit instructive to you as you try to say, where can I make a difference? How can I be a part of the solution? We've got this crisis going on, and maybe I'm already involved a little bit. Maybe I'm involved a fair amount, or maybe I'm just getting started and thinking about it. Where can I make my greatest impact so that one day I'm getting pictures of children who are alive because of me? So one day I'm hearing from a dad who says, my mind was changed. I'm saving my children's lives because of something you did. What can we do? For me, I wish I could tell you that from the very beginning I was this radical, pro-life, hardcore, let's go get them done. I wasn't. In fact, I grew up in a Christian home in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. At our church, I never heard a sermon about abortion. It was never discussed in my home. And as a result, it just went over my head. I never even thought about it, to be honest. It wasn't until I moved to Texas. My dad got transferred to Dallas. I moved to Texas, and I decided to go to school at Texas A&M University. And that was where God began to reach me. Because I was surrounded by both Catholic and evangelical Christians who were on fire with their faith, and they helped me to understand that the gospel message of 2,000 years ago was just as relevant and applicable today and to the challenges we face in our culture today as it was way back then. And they helped me to understand about the crisis of abortion. They helped me to understand that in every abortion a child dies. In every abortion a woman is scarred, sometimes physically, but always emotionally, psychologically, spiritually. Families are torn apart. Our culture is being desensitized to violence. They helped me to understand that we had this crisis around us. But I, at that point, became what I would call a passive pro-lifer. Oh, I don't like abortion, but I don't want to get involved. This is controversial. People might not like me if I were to be so daring as to try to do something. And so I sat on the sidelines, no different than that train, sitting on the tracks in Missouri before it started moving. But several things happened that began to change the course of my life and began to develop some momentum. Number one is God introduced me to the beautiful young lady sitting at the table over there, smiling right now, my wife of 25 years, my best friend Margaret. We met while in college, and Margaret began to share stories with me of growing up in Corpus Christi, Texas. And she grew up in a Catholic family, and every Sunday her parents would take her and her sisters, reluctantly many times, to go out and pray outside of local abortion centers. And there were many times Margaret didn't want to do that. Am I correct? But you did it anyway, right? Because your parents made you. And because they went week after week after week, Margaret and her two sisters saw miracles happen. They saw lives saved. But over a period of several years, they saw every one of those abortion facilities in the city of Corpus Christi, Texas, close down and go out of business. Yay! So as Margaret and I were dating and eventually got married, I began to sweat a little bit. Because I thought, I don't like abortion, it's bad. Ooh, there's things that you can do about it, but they sound kind of, in-your-face controversial. Do I have to do something? And I looked around my town where we were living, College Station, Texas. There was not an abortion facility, so I thought, I'm off the hook. I don't have to do anything. This is great. And then the news broke in 1998 that Planned Parenthood, which had had a referral office in our town, but did not perform abortions there, but because they were in a college town, because they saw the market potential of young people that they could get engaged in risky lifestyles, they said, we need to open an abortion center. And the news broke that they had raised $1.2 million. Regrettably, a portion of that was raised by my former pastor in the church I was going to at the time. And they were going to build this first ever abortion center. Our town was in the Bible Belt, came unglued. And there was a young church secretary named Lauren who called a few friends and said, we need to get together at our church library. We need to talk about what can we do to try to stop this. Well, the newspaper in our community found out, and they ran a big front page story saying abortion foes plan to counter Planned Parenthood. And instead of a handful of people meeting in the church library, 400 people showed up that night, and they met in the church sanctuary. And it was people from every kind of faith background. And I've always loved that about the pro-life movement. We may not see eye to eye on theology, but we can stand arm in arm, united in our commitment to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. And that night the church was packed, and Margaret said to me, David, we need to go to that meeting. And any of you who are married, you know your wives can be incredibly persuasive people, right? I had no choice at that point. So when we got to the church, I'm reluctant. Margaret's saying, let's go sit right up in the front. And I said, can we please sit in the back? I want to be able to escape quickly when the time comes. And we ended up sitting somewhere in the middle, kind of a negotiated truce. And as I looked around the room that night, here are these people who are sharper than I was. People who had money. People who knew how to articulate, like Josh, the humanity of human life and the equal rights argument. I had none of that. I had never done anything in this realm before. And I thought to myself, I'm just one person. I have no discernible gifts here. How could I make a difference? But for whatever reason, that night, in that church, God began to whisper silently to me, you have a role. And I didn't know what it was. And we began to take baby steps. I wish I could tell you I ran right into this. I didn't. The first thing we did is we went out to pray at the place where they were building the abortion center. And I remember just being so deeply burdened, standing at that place and watching this facility being constructed and realizing children are going to lose their lives in our community. Women are going to be wounded here. And then we began to volunteer an hour here and an hour there for the local group that was formed out of those people who had come together at the church that night. And we began to do a little bit here and a little bit there, but it was just seemed like it wasn't enough. And I remember that was in 1998. The abortion center opened the following year in 1999. And they began to spill the blood of innocent children because the community hadn't been awake, hadn't been alert before the crisis came. It came. And when it came, the body of Christ initially was in this uproar, but then within a year, 2 years, 3 years, it seemed like people just resigned themselves to saying, well, we tried to stop it and we couldn't, so oh well, I guess we have to accept this. And I remember a day, it was June 26th of 2001. It was a day that changed the direction of my entire life. Because I was working at the time as a drug dealer, a pharmaceutical sales rep. I just wanted to clarify. It was all legal, Josh, in case you're recording this. And I was selling medicines to doctors in a town about 30 miles north of where we lived. And my phone rang, and it was Lauren, that church secretary who had taken the helm of that local group. And she said, David, Planned Parenthood just aborted 10 more children today. And that was the day that finally God broke my heart. Because I realized we're not doing enough. We know things we should be doing and we're not doing them. There are things we need to seek out and try to find what's working elsewhere. And I just was devastated. And without even thinking, I said on the phone to my friend Lauren, I said, maybe what I'm supposed to do is just quit my job and devote my full-time energy to trying to stop this. I was just talking out loud. You understand, I would never have proposed this. There's a long pause on the other end of the phone, and Lauren says, why don't you do that? I was taken aback. So I went home, and I was sure Margaret would talk me out of this because practically it made no sense in the world. But Margaret said, you know, David, to whom much is given, much is required. So we went and talked to our pastor. And 2 weeks from that day, I resigned from the pharmaceutical industry and took a leap to help run that local pro-life organization. Again, I wish I could tell you everything went great. The organization was on this upward trajectory. They were the train heading down the tracks out of town. We had a little bit of progress, and then we had some defeats. A little bit of progress and defeats, and it seemed like things were actually trending down, and the abortion numbers were going up in our community. And again, we felt lost, frustrated, despair. And I know those don't come from God, but that was how we felt. I remember a banquet we had for that organization, and it was announced that I was stepping away from my role at that organization, and frankly, I felt like a failure. I was ready to quit. I was ready to go on and do other things where people would actually like me, where people would want to do what I was a part of instead of running away like, oh no, it's the weird people. Don't be weird. No, the pro-lifers, we can be weird sometimes. That night we had a speaker come into town by the name of Joe Scheidler. And Joe gave a riveting talk right after it was announced that I was stepping away from the organization. And during his talk, he said, there's somebody in this room that is supposed to recommit themselves and give themselves fully to this movement. And it was like it was piercing right into my heart. It was like he was talking to me. Years later, I told Joe, I said, Joe, that was a pivotal moment for me to recommit to the pro-life movement. I said, you were talking to me that night. He said, oh, I say that at every one of my talks. I was like, that's okay. That night, it was meant for me. But we kept pressing on through all of that. But one of the moments that was pivotal was when in 2004, still seeing things not going where we wanted them to go, 4 of us met in our little pro-life office around a wooden table out of frustration and said, we don't know anymore what to do. We've tried everything we know how to do, and it was scattershot. One week we'd be handing out voters' guides. The next week we'd be handing out flowers after masses and church services. And the next week we'd be trying to give talks in homes. And we were just trying bumper stickers. We tried everything. And it just seemed it wasn't just cohesive and nothing was working. And so we met in that office and we sat around this table, and the 4 of us said, we need to do something different. And we decided to pray for an hour. Now, why we hadn't done something like that earlier, I don't know. But during that hour of prayer, God began to convict us about what he wanted us to do next. The first thing that he began to weigh upon our hearts during that hour of prayer was a time frame, and the time frame was 40 days. I don't know about you, but when I read my Bible, that time frame shows up over and over again. Maybe God's trying to get our attention, right? And it's a time frame that God has used throughout history both to test the faithfulness of his people and to transform things. Noah on the ark, Moses on Mount Sinai, Jesus in the wilderness being tempted by the devil before really beginning into his public ministry, the apostles with our Lord following his resurrection, the 40-day time frame over and over again. And as we were praying, we said, well, we need some transformation. We need to be faithful. And so we said, let's do something for 40 days. And there were 3 things that we felt we had to do. Number 1, prayer and fasting. And I know Josh said when you're having these arguments or discussions with pro-choice people, you don't make the case from your faith, particularly if they're not a person of faith. But for most of us here, I suspect that part of why we do this is because we understand that life is a gift from God. And we also understand that we can't do this on our own. When you look at the Maryland situation, when you look at these 28,140 abortions, 77 more every day, I don't know about you, but ending that seems impossible with man. But we know that with God, all things are possible. Not just easy or politically correct things. We're told all things. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And so we decided we needed to pray and fast. Put God first. Fasting also because, frankly, I had never fasted in my life prior to that point. Marrying a Catholic Christian, every Lent, Margaret was teaching me about fasting. I'd grown up in a Protestant tradition that didn't emphasize fasting. But I read in Scripture where it talked about some demons can only be driven out through prayer and fasting. And we said, maybe this is something that we need to do. So that was the first thing. The second thing then that we felt we had to do was go to the place where lives were being lost. In our community, it was a Planned Parenthood abortion center where more than 2,000 children had perished, where women had been hauled off to the emergency room in an ambulance because Planned Parenthood had botched their abortions and couldn't even patch together the damage they had caused. We said we need to go to that place, we need to gather in the public right away, and we need to get down on our knees and we need to pray. And we need to ask God to end what's happening here. And we need to be there 24 hours a day for 40 days. Sounds crazy, but that was what was on our heart. And the third and final thing that we felt we had to do was community outreach. Because frankly, the most powerful advertising in the entire world is not a billboard right out here on the highway. It's not an ad during the Super Bowl. It's you talking to your friends and family members and fellow believers in your church. That's why it's so crucial that you take what Josh is sharing with you and you dive into his Equipped for Life course and learn these things, because those conversations can not only change minds, they can save lives. And so we felt we needed to go, in our case, door to door to 35,000 households. And we had a team of college students that agreed to do this, to invite people to pray and fast and be a part of this crazy effort that we were praying about and discerning. So we finished our hour of prayer, and we felt that God had given us this clarion call, 40 days of prayer and fasting, a vigil of outreach, and I was terrified. We had never done anything that crazy ambitious. I didn't think we could pull it off. But when we realized children were going to perish that next week in our town, we said we have to gain momentum. We can't rest on our laurels and just say we'll keep doing what we've been doing. We need to do more. And we decided to do that first ever 40 Days for Life campaign. And much to our amazement, God moved over 1,000 people to participate in that inaugural effort. And by the end of that year, abortions in our community had fallen by 28%. Over 100 children's lives were spared because the many parts of the body of Christ came together and became that voice for the voiceless. Well, I wish I could say that at the end we were fired up and ready to go on. We weren't. We were exhausted. We thought, woo, check that box. We're done. We'll never do that again. That was crazy. Nor would anybody else ever be crazy enough to do this. But one by one, other cities on their own, not because of us, I think it was the Holy Spirit, they were inspired to do the same thing they'd heard about. 40 days of prayer and fasting, 40 days of vigil, 40 days of outreach. And it began to spread city by city by city. That was from 2004 to 2007. By this point, Margaret and I had moved from Texas up here to Virginia. I was working at American Life League, and we thought that chapter was over in our lives. But we started to see that God was still doing something with this little 40-day thing. And so we got on the phone, a conference call with all the people who had run these disparate individual 40 Days for Life campaigns, and we said, what's going on? And as we began to hear the same kinds of results, lives saved, hearts and minds changed, people finding healing from past abortions, we said, God's doing something here. Are we supposed to join him in what he's doing? And so we decided, why don't we try to put together a national 40 Days for Life? And we could have like a dozen cities doing this at the same time across the country. That was our big vision. Instead, we put the word out. 89 cities across 33 states joined in that first 40 Days for Life campaign. And since that time, it has only continued to snowball and grow and grow and grow. Today, more than 715 cities have participated across all 50 American states in 40 Days for Life campaigns. 750,000 volunteers have participated in these 40 Days for Life campaigns. Many of them speak languages I don't even speak. So that's how we know it's not us. It was the Holy Spirit that was driving this entire process. As Ali mentioned in the introduction, more than 13,000 lives have been saved. 156 abortion workers have had changes of heart and left the abortion industry. People like Abby Johnson, perhaps you've heard her story. Abby was the director of the Planned Parenthood Abortion Center, outside of which we did that first 40 Days for Life campaign. And one of the campaigns that was happening outside her facility, on day 38, she was inside, and the out-of-town abortionist called her into the procedure room and said, I need help. I'm doing an ultrasound-guided abortion, which she had never seen. She thought this will be a great learning experience. So she went into the procedure room and was watching on the TV screen as a 13-week-old baby boy was moving around healthy and happy in the womb. And then she saw in the picture the cannula, the thin tube that's used for the abortion procedure, enter. And it began to poke and prod the little baby boy, and she saw him jerk away in pain. And she thought, this is going to be bad. And then she said, no. Planned Parenthood has convinced me it's just a blob of tissue. It's not a person yet. No. It's not going to be bad. But then the abortionist callously joked to one of the other attendants in the room and said, beam me up, Scotty. And that was the sign to turn on the suction machine. And she watched that tube as he began to pull that child apart limb from limb right before her eyes. And she watched that little boy fight for life until ultimately he lost that fight. And Abby was devastated and said, I can never do this again. I can't believe that I had my own abortions and didn't realize this. I sold thousands of abortions and didn't know this. But where do I go? What do I do? And she went back to her office, and through her tears, she looked out the window, and there were two women praying outside. And she felt God was telling her to go to them. And she did. And they began to help her on her journey out of Planned Parenthood through her own healing. And eventually, as Abby began to share her story, she felt led to set up a ministry called And Then There Were None. And she has now helped more than 350 other workers leave the abortion industry because people loved her out of the work that she was doing. And as was mentioned also, 90 abortion centers have closed their doors and gone out of business for good following 40 Days for Life campaigns. The one that meant the most to me was number 34, because it was the abortion center in College Station, Texas. It was the one where we had gone when it was being built and realized children are going to die here. Women are going to be wounded here. It was the one I'd spent hundreds, if not thousands of hours praying outside of. The one where we'd held that first 40 Days for Life campaign. And when we heard the news that it was going to close, we didn't even know that we were going to be in town on the last day it was in business because we were visiting friends in Texas. And we went by as they were loading the furniture into the trucks, and we prayed and thanked God for bringing this outcome about. And then we went to we went to daily mass at St. Mary's, and afterwards I said, can we go back one more time? And they dropped me off, and I just stood out there after the gates closed for the last time and realized no more children will ever die here again. No more women will ever cry here again. We have to remember why we do this. And if you've not met a child like the story of the quadruplets that I shared, who's alive because of you, if you've not seen an abortion facility, perhaps the one in College Park or another one, close its doors for good, then we need to rededicate ourselves today. We need to gain momentum today, and we need to keep pressing on until such time as this injustice, the greatest injustice of our generation, ends for once and for all. I've shared a lot about my experiences and my stories, and really that's not the most important story here today. The most important story in this room at St. Joseph's Catholic Church in Pomfret, Maryland, is your story. There's some lives that only you can save. There are some mothers that only you can protect from a lifetime of regrets. There are some people who will only find healing from past abortions because you invite them to find that healing through Jesus Christ. There are some people you will only be able to persuade because of what you learned from Josh. Somebody somewhere needs your story. So my encouragement to you today is to look deep inside. Number one, pray. Ask God Almighty to show you what He wants you to do. Ask Him to convict your heart and burden you about this crisis, to realize those 77 children are precious in His sight. Do I view those children who will die tomorrow the same way God does? And if I do, am I willing to act like it? Pray. Number two is educate yourself. Take the information you're learning here and will continue to learn. We have the Q&A panel this afternoon with Michelle and Heather and Josh and myself, and all the information at the vendors' tables at the room next door. Gather it all in and educate yourself, because then you can educate and empower other people. Number three, after you pray, after you educate yourself, it's time to act. It's time to figure out where God wants to use you. And here's a little exercise. I just want to give you one thought, because sometimes you look at all the things. You're going to go over and look at all the tables, these different organizations. You're going to say, where do I start? Well, yes, you can pick one, but what I'd encourage you to do is pick the best one to start. And here's a way to do that. On a piece of paper at some point, maybe today, maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow, jot down the answers to 3 questions. The first question is, what are my greatest passions and burdens? What are my greatest passions and burdens? What is it that fills your heart with joy? What is it that weighs on you? And particularly as it relates to this issue we are gathered together around. Number 2, what are my skills and experiences? What are my skills and experiences? You probably will do something very different from what I do. You probably will do something very different from what Josh does, but you have something that your past has prepared you for that can make a world-changing difference. So go through and think about, what am I gifted at? What are my spiritual gifts? What are my talents? What's my personality? What are the things that I've had experiences in doing? And find a way to apply those. And then the third question is, what can meet the greatest need around me? So what are my passions and burdens? What are my talents and experiences? And that meet the greatest need around me. So look around and say, do I feel the most burden for the women in unexpected pregnancies? Maybe you're supposed to work in maternity home or pregnancy center ministries. Do I feel burden for that child in the womb? Maybe you're supposed to be a sidewalk advocate outside of an abortion center or participate in a 40 Days for Life campaign. Do I feel very convicted and feel that the need is, I'm on a high school or college campus and there are a lot of people who are ill-informed and ill-equipped and they're frankly misled and misguided. Maybe you're supposed to start a Students for Life group. Maybe you're supposed to become a leader. So weigh those 3 questions and then use that as your filter as you go over and look at the tables, and either join a group or start a group of your own. You can't do this on your own. There are people, Jack Ames has been doing this work. Jack, how long have you been engaged in pro-life work?
Since 1971.
Since 1971. Could you do this by yourself? No. It takes all of us. Just like the many parts make up the body of Christ, so too the pro-life movement is made up of many parts. There are different organizations, there are different efforts, there are different people. We need to work together. So you need to make sure that you are part of other people who are like-minded and will press forward together. Whether it's getting a group started in your church, maybe it's a prayer effort, maybe that's where God's calling you. Maybe it's to be involved in pregnancy centers. You're going to hear during the Q&A panel from Heather, and you're going to hear about the opportunity to come alongside women in a time of need. And maybe that's where God is calling you to get more involved. Maybe it's to help with post-abortion healing ministries. Either you know somebody who hasn't yet found healing, or maybe you haven't found healing from a past abortion. And after you go through that healing and forgiveness process, then to offer that hope and healing to others. Maybe for you, it's to be outside of these abortion centers. To participate. I know 40 Days for Life that's happening right now ends tomorrow, but that doesn't mean the need ends tomorrow. Maybe it's to go to College Park or find the abortion facility nearest to you and gather there. Maybe it's just to pray. Maybe it's just to hold a sign that says, we'll help you. Or maybe to get trained as a sidewalk counselor, sidewalk advocate, where you can offer hope and help to other people. Maybe your role is to get involved in educating people. Maybe it's holding displays on the side of the road. Maybe it's going into classrooms. Maybe it's speaking to youth or adults and educating them. Maybe your role, you're going to cringe when I say this one, maybe your role is to get more engaged in public policy here in Maryland. You go, no. Don't you know what a mess our political system is in Maryland? Yes, I know what a mess it is. That's why we need you more involved in the public policy process. You need to make sure you go to the polls and vote pro-life every opportunity you have. Know who the candidates are, know where they stand, and vote, no exceptions, pro-life. Make sure you vote to support good legislation and vote to kill bad legislation. Get more involved, and frankly, there could be somebody here today that God is calling you to run for office. You say, I don't want to do that. We need more good, God-fearing men and women in our political system, and maybe that's you. Maybe it's to stop some of the bad things like the euthanasia or assisted suicide efforts that are trying to get a foothold in your state. Maybe it's to advance good things like getting abortion facility regulations that are moving towards the closure of these facilities. Somebody here, maybe that's your call. There are so many different ways you can get involved. Find your thing. There's a brilliant book that I read last year, changed my whole perspective on this. It's a business book. It doesn't even really relate to pro-life, but it's called The One Thing. The author's name is Gary Keller. Gary Keller, who co-founded Keller Williams Real Estate. The whole premise of this book is at any given moment in time, there is one thing we can do that can have the greatest impact. And there's a Russian proverb at the very beginning. When you open the cover of the book, it said, "Man who chases after two rabbits will catch neither one." In the same way for us, you don't need to do everything in the pro-life movement. You need to try to determine your one thing. The one thing that you can do through which God can accomplish the most good. And you know what? You may start down the wrong road. But until a car is moving, it cannot be steered. So get in motion, like that train heading out of the tracks. And if you find, you know what? I'm really not equipped for this activism. Maybe I'm more equipped for ministry at a pregnancy center. Or maybe I'm not as equipped for being on the side of the road doing this. Maybe I'm equipped for that. But get in motion. Find your one thing. And the sooner you find your one thing, the sooner God will begin to transform lives, transform hearts, and change Maryland and America for life. I just want to end with just a few examples. There was a person who felt called to get involved in this work. She lived in Baltimore, and she looked at the Whole Woman's Health abortion facility in Baltimore. She said, we need to do something about that. And in 2013, she ran the first 40 Days for Life campaign outside of that facility. She continued to hold campaigns outside of that facility. Lives were saved. Hearts and minds were changed. People were reached with a life-saving message, but she was convicted to do more. The train was beginning to pick up steam heading down the tracks. And so in 2016, she and other people around her formed a pregnancy center right across the street from that abortion facility. And in addition, she set up a curriculum to train and help other people in understanding how to articulate their pro-life positions. Or what about the example of a young girl who, after graduating from college in Maryland, she was convicted to be involved in helping young people. And so she became a school teacher. And for 10 years, she was in the classroom loving on children. And in her spare time, she'd volunteer a little bit here and there with pro-life efforts. And she began to get more convicted and get more involved in pro-life efforts. And eventually, she felt led to dedicate herself to ending abortion and to helping and empowering women so that they didn't feel that they had to have abortions. And she went to the organization Students for Life of America, and she became a regional director. And today, half of the United States, hundreds of campuses, have been impacted by her life-saving work. But what about another young woman? She was a college student at the University of Virginia. She was studying global public health and Spanish and bioethics. And she was part of her pro-life student group at her campus there. And she started to get more involved and more involved. And while she was in school, she did an internship with 40 Days for Life. And as she did that internship, she felt convicted that this kind of is the merger of the health needs in our world as well as my Spanish experience. And she came on board as the director of Hispanic Outreach and Youth Outreach for 40 Days for Life. And she's now traveled to Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, Panama, and across the United States, helping to get more people involved in pro-life and save more lives. Those three people's stories I just told you are here today at this event. The first one who got involved in the 40 Days for Life in Baltimore and then ended up helping to set up the pregnancy center and the curriculum, that's Jody Ward. She's sitting right here, right in front of me. Raise your hand, Jody. The second story I shared with you, that's Michelle Hendrickson, the regional director for Students for Life of America for the eastern half of the United States. And the third story, I don't think she's in the room because I think she's over at the exhibit booth getting set up. That's Catherine O'Brien, who's now working with 40 Days for Life. Be sure to go over and talk to her as well. And I could tell you more stories. I mean, here's Jack Ames or Loretta Fleming with the March for Life. Or we look at what Allie is doing here through this conference. There are so many people right here who are proving that you can gain momentum. You can get the train out of the station, get moving, and then keep building momentum faster and faster and faster. And if we are willing to look to all of these examples and say, God, I'm going to pray, I'm going to educate myself, I'm going to act, and I'm going to continue to grow and grow and grow until that day when abortion ends. That will be the turning point, and that will be the day that will forever be etched in the history books as when abortion ended. Not practically in terms of the facilities all closing and lives all being saved, but that was when they saw the shift. Like that locker room at that football game, they saw the momentum shift. And I believe when you walk out of here, that's what's going to happen in Southern Maryland and beyond, wherever you came from. People are going to look and say, something happened in the locker room. Because all of a sudden they came back out on the field, and even though they were down, and even though 77 children a day were dying in Maryland, they came back out optimistic, hope-filled, and ready to win. And they kept pressing forward and kept pressing forward, and one day it will end. And your children and your grandchildren will be able to look at you years from now and say, when the rest of the world was busy doing their thing, the history books say, you were doing the right thing. And they will be filled with pride knowing, I come from good stock. I come from parents that were willing to do whatever it took. No, it wasn't comfortable. No, it wasn't easy. And yes, at times I didn't want to do it, but I did it anyway. And because I did it, abortion has ended. And one day you'll be meeting those children who are alive because of the work you did. One day the College Park Abortion Center will be closed and all the other ones across Maryland. One day this will end. And you will know, because of your work, the culture has changed, and this movement is unstoppable. And the rest of the world will follow. God bless you.